All right, we want to welcome you out to part two of our interview with the fridge prophet. We finished up in our last discussion um, around the time that your son came back home from his mission, and you had just informed your parents of your new position relative to the church. I want to, if you could take just a few minutes and finish that story up. And then there's one other thing that you mentioned that we'll get to, and then we'll delve into the Church of the Fridge itself.
Okay, sounds good. I still can't get over doing the puppet thing. It's kind of funny. If you would have asked me a couple of years ago, even like 6 months ago, dude, you're going to be doing a podcast with a puppet in the future, I would have said you're completely nuts. But here I am. Oh yeah, I gotta. Yeah, you're going to see a lot of talking in my head. Let's see. So we were talking about just to explain to my parents the that my that I just barely my wife and I just barely told my parents that I didn't believe in the church anymore, and it was because I didn't want my son coming home on his mission and facing that kind of disgrace, if you will. I thought that was a big deal to me.
I understand a lot of these young men, when they come home, if they come home early, and we are seeing a little bit more of that just anecdotally, there's all sorts of stigma that appear to be attached to it.
Oh yeah, and there is. It's like, and he didn't get a dishonorable discharge or anything. I don't even think they really give those. He came home for medical reasons, depression, and it was a big deal. I mean, talking to professionals, psychologists, if a person has indicated their willingness to or their thoughts on suicide to more than one person, that's typically a sign of a very severe depression. And so I didn't really know then quite how bad things were. And once he got home, it was months and months and months of recovery, and that really surprised me.
Hmm. Did he open up to you about just his state of mind?
Oh yeah, he had been pretty open in our email communications because he really couldn't talk on the phone. But I understood where he was. I just didn't realize how severely affected he was until he was in front of us. My one really cool one thing that happened is I explained this to my family, and for the most part, they took it pretty well. For our family, families is super important, and in this situation, family was more important than our beliefs, and that kind of surprised me. I was expecting a stronger reaction, which ironically happened a few months after that, but at the time, there really wasn't, it was really pretty acceptable, and it was hard telling my dad because I knew he was going to be so disappointed. Being faithful in the church was a major, major thing, and for somebody to be no longer believe, it was heartbreaking for him, I think, and for my mom as well.
I remember that feeling in my own experience where you you're at a particular place and you just have this sense that if you can just stick it out until you don't have to give your parents the pain that you feel like they're going to get if you confront them with that. And I think that my fear of that was bigger than it ended up being. And a lot of it had to do with the similar sort of thing where in our family, it really was our family first before the organization. And so that helped a lot.
It definitely helped a bunch. And if I have any advice out there, if you're going to tell your parents, I think my wife and I stumbled onto a really good way to deal with it. We invited them to dinner. And the nice thing about being in dinner is you're in a public place, so you kind of tend to keep the lid on any strong emotions, which are definitely going to be felt. And that helped a lot. So we bought them dinner, told them, and I I kind of told my mom, I said, I just don't believe anymore. And she says, well, I kind of suspected there were issues. You know, it was kind of obvious to her that I had been questioning. And, you know, your parents are actually more in tune to your life than some might readily admit, and mine were in tune in that sense. So it went pretty well, and a couple days later we met and told my wife's parents. By this point in time, my wife and I were in complete agreement as far as the church was concerned. Neither of us had a testimony anymore, and you know that. So it was good that we were together on it. I think that
I
was
want to
helpful.
clarify something on that because that's something that you hear a lot of former Mormons say, and it's almost like we say it with shame in our heart. You know, I lost my testimony. I don't have a testimony anymore. And to true believing Mormons, they hear that, and it sounds like this terrible shame of badge of shame that's just awful. And it's not so much that you've lost your testimony of the church as it is that you have gained a new testimony of authenticity and truth, and the church doesn't meet that standard.
That's a pretty good point. I think you're right on the money as far as your integrity is what really drives you to this situation. And I think the reason you frame it up that way is because you've been taught that way for however long.
Exactly.
I mean,
It's a psychological buzzword.
absolutely. And you're warned over and over and over again in the church, if you do this evil thing, you'll lose your testimony. You know, if you smoke, you'll lose your testimony. If you'll drink, you'll lose your testimony. If you do anything wrong, you'll lose your testimony. And these days, it's if you read the internet, you'll lose your testimony.
Yeah. If you Google, you'll lose your testimony.
Google is the great destroyer of all testimonies. But it is an indoctrinated thing that you'll lose your testimony. And I don't know. I thought a lot of the song "Losing My Religion," and it actually is very poignant as you go through that. Says because there is I do think there's a feeling of loss. Because you lose. It's. I mean, what 9-year-old or 8-year-old or however young you were, what child hasn't experienced the loss of the magic of Santa Claus? Of course, I look like Santa Claus, which is kind of funny in itself, but you know, it's you lose a bit of magic to life. You lose. You realize that some hopes and dreams you had were simply made up, and there's not a lot you can do about it once that realization dawns on you. It's just gone.
That's funny that you bring that up because my wife and I had conversations about our kind of moral dilemma in doing the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus because we feel like, well, there's these quasi-religious things that we are telling them is real, and then they're going to find out that it's not real. And so, you know, are they going to draw the connection from that and then say, well, wait a second, what about, you know, the church? What about God? Are you going to pull that rug from out from under me as well?
You know, that's a really good question, and in part leads to the whole fridge topic.
Well, before we get to the fridge
we'll,
topic,
we'll talk about that later, but keep that thought about
all right.
about the loss of myth.
Now, going back to your parents, you told us a little bit how they accepted it, and your son came home, and then he went through a period of healing himself. You made some allusion to a conflict that happened when you first started talking with your family about your feelings and well, I guess it's not when you first started, but when you eventually had direct face-to-face confrontation or discussion about your attitude and opinion of the church. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think a typical process that you go through is this process of discovery, and it's not unlike the kind of feelings I had as a missionary. When I went out as a missionary, I was confident that I had the truth. I was absolutely sure this was God's one true church, and I felt that zealous need to share it with others.
All you
And
had to do was present it to them, and they were going to see the undeniable truth of it.
absolutely, that's exactly how I felt as a missionary. And ironically, I gone through very similar feelings after. It was like, hey, everybody, look at all this stuff. I mean, you know, it
It's
was
so
discovery.
obvious. It's
Yeah,
so obvious.
exactly. It was discovery after discovery after discovery of how did I ever not see this before? All this stuff that people told you were lies, it's 99% true. And it just blew my mind. And the reality is people, they don't want to know that. They just don't want to know. And the it's totally ironic. A church that's, based on the idea of truth and everybody finds and values truth no matter where it may come from. As soon as you say, hey, look at this true thing, well, that's not true. But look, it's well documented. It's right in the own church's history. Well, if it is true, it must be fine because, I mean, it's just, you naturally set those things aside. And part of my discovery path was understanding psychologically the reasons people believe things. I don't know if you've been to the website Ask Reality.
Oh yeah,
It's Chris, I can't remember his name, but he's the
Johnson, I
guy
think.
he's the guy that did the research on the late war and stuff. He has
Yeah.
a video series about psychology and religion, and he looks at psychology from the perspective of a Mormon looking into Jehovah's Witnesses. And it's really easy for us to see reality when it's not our own. And so, part of the discovery for me was understanding this. I'm personally an extremely spiritual person. I don't know if we talked about that in our last run, but I think we did mention it, that I have numerous events in my life where I had very spiritual, concrete spiritual evidence as far as I was concerned that, this was the true church and everything was right, and and that was a difficult thing for me to resolve in my own head, in relation to how could I have this feeling that it's absolutely right, and yet logically, rationally, if I looked at this history with the same reason that I look at an MLM scheme or a used car salesman, it simply doesn't cut the mustard. Why do these two things not line up? And I discovered that feelings just simply aren't as reliable as we think or hope they are. Stranger
That
coming.
that's actually that is a huge topic for people that come out of the church, because when you start talking with people about your factual discoveries in church history and the things which would, by all accounts, point to Joseph Smith as a charlatan, then people, they turn off their brains. I use the word turn off their brain not to imply that they're stupid. I'm just saying that you suspend the same critical thinking that you would apply towards a used car salesman, as you mentioned. But they turn off that critical thinking, and then you have a fallback position. Frequently it's, well, my testimony is not based on the history of the church or the facts of Joseph Smith. It's based on my own personal spiritual experience and my own testimony and witness that happened. And so that's the thing that when you're talking with people, you kind of have to try to show how, those experiences are not as reliable as we were told they were.
That's a good point. And the fact is, most members already know this. It dawned on me as I was studying. I began to study psychology because I was trying to figure out. Well, I knew that it just simply was illogical. There was far too much evidence stacked against the church. It wasn't one single thing wrong. It was over 100 things. By the time I listed everything that I could list about the evidence against the church being true versus the evidence for it being true, it was well over 100 things were against it being factual. The list was huge. And the only thing that sat on the side of the sheet that said the church is true was my testimony, my spiritual witness. And it honestly was the single only thing. it was this gigantic mountain of evidence against and one experience for.
It's funny because when you talk to apologists, they'll say, well, here's a explanation which could explain away that thing that you think is proof against the church. And somebody pointed out that apologists deal in possibilities, not probabilities. So, you could say then to the apologist, well, it's true that that's possible. It's possible that God did command Joseph to marry a 14-year-old. But then you have to say, is it probable? And one way to look at that question is to take that list of 100 different reasons that you have and say, okay, well, let's just give them the benefit of the doubt, and let's say that it's 75% probable that this question would be decided in favor of the church, but there's still 25% chance that, in fact, it's a sign of falseness. And then you just take that probability of 75% and then multiply it by all those different 100 things, and you just get kind of a mathematical, statistical impossibility that it could all add up to one true church.
That's totally true. And the irony, it's funny you mentioned that, because just today I was reading on FAIR, and I try to remember what the topic was in regards to. I think it had to do with it was a particular testimony of somebody that had something negative towards the church, and they did this statistical analysis just like you did, and they said, okay, so if this guy really was this, and then plus 50% chance of that, and they used exactly your reasoning to prove their point that this guy was probably lying and wasn't really telling us the truth in regards to this one questionable bit of history. And I thought that is so ironic, because I've read exactly those apologists explain. So they knocked on the fair apologists knocked on this case of it was a first-hand account, but it was negative, and the guy had left the church. I think it was something David Whitmer said, and they said first-hand account, chance he left the church. There's only a 15% chance this guy is even remotely telling the truth, or some bogus number like that. But I've read exactly those same apologists write in terms of the Book of Abraham. They say, well, there's this 30-foot long scroll that nobody knows where it is, and we know about this because of a fourth-hand account that was written 75 years after the fact, that probably is what happened. And they hang their hat on that. Yeah, the long scroll theory, which makes absolutely no sense at all. And
well, see,
it was the memory of like a 7-year-old kid written down 70 years later, third-hand witness, and that is your reason it's really legit. And then yet you take a first-hand witness guy and you use probabilities to prove he's up in the night. I mean, come on, guys, let's play fair. My loss of my testimony was at least 50% driven by the illogical, irrational arguments of fair. If somebody wants to lose their testimony, go read the guys that defend the church for a living. If you put it in any perspective, if you compare one set of notes to another set of notes, those guys are they never ever play fair. They will not apply the same logical rationale to their own thought processes that they'll apply to their defensive positions. Not even close.
The great irony of their name.
Yeah, they don't play fair.
This is the these are the different loops of logic that you get involved in when you start to talk with people about these concerns and they bring up their defenses. What sort of discussions did you have with your family once you were able to start talking with them more directly about your findings?
Ironically, most of my discussions with my family occurred on the internet. I really didn't spend a lot of time confronting them face to face, except that one time. And
which one time did we talk about?
Well, no, there's two times really. The first time we told them in person,
yeah.
And I could tell they just didn't ever want to talk about it. When I started talking to my in-laws, my wife's mom, I started going into some of my reasons, and I could see she was visibly shaken. And my wife kind of tapped me on the shoulder and and I could tell that she was concerned because her mom was close to tears, and I think she was beginning to see some of my reasons, and I backed off for my wife because she didn't want to see her mom in pain like that, and I think she feared the loss of her testimony. My wife's parents are actual first converts. My wife's mom converted at like 18, and her dad sometime around there. And they've been really actually pretty good to work with. I think they had an experience pre-church on how to deal with family that are not members, because more than half of their family aren't. Most of their family are non-members or members of other denominations, and they'd grown accustomed how to make different beliefs work. In my family, we're fifth generation. Nobody had a clue how to deal with an apostate. Um, so we didn't say much, but I did spend a lot of time as I came out and finally decided I needed to be open. I started posting things on Facebook and trying to, here's why I lost my testimony, guys. Look at this bit of truth. This is legit history. And that started getting kind of a backlash, and we ended up in a lot of threads and discussions
They would
publicly.
actually comment on your posts?
Yeah, my mom commented, my sister would comment, and I would explain my point, and they would counter, and I got a lot of testimony bearing, and I know you're just wrong just because you're wrong, and this stuff is all lies, and then I'd point them at actual church history documents and say, look, you can easily prove that Joseph Smith willingly lied to almost 300 saints. He absolutely deceived people. There's no doubt about it. It happened like 2 weeks before he died, and you can prove it with only church documents, only church evidence.
That's
And
hilarious. That's exactly what I did in my thing. That was one of the first things I posted on Facebook was I did a timeline about when the Revelation D&C 132 came, when he was married, and when he said, what a thing it is to be accused of having 7 wives when I can only find one.
oh
And
yeah, that
then,
was totally deceptive. He was
yeah,
literally lying to people to hide the polygamy. And we know he was married to 30 some odd wives. And that was, for me, that was one of my big things, was his deception. The fact that something I learned a long time ago in psychology class and in interviewing, because I had a whole lecture on how to interview people for a job. One of the things they teach you, and it's a psychological basis, past performance predicts future behavior. If you've been lying and cheating at work, it's a really good chance you'll do the same thing at this job. So you learn how to pick that out, and if a person was willingly lying then, well, what means he was telling the truth any other time? You've broken the people's trust, and the people's trust he broke were new immigrants that just barely converted and came over from England. It's these almost 300 people showed up on a boat. They had sold everything, they'd given up everything to come follow this leader, and they land in town and they hear all these rumors. Well, he's spiritual wives. He's got this going on. They're hearing this stuff about the hits on the was it Governor Boggs, I think? Yeah,
yeah,
and they're hearing all this rumor mill going on. And so what does Joseph get up? He gets up and he totally rips on William Law, who is one of the people telling this stuff, and calls William Law a flat-out liar. The thing
bearing
was,
false witness against William Law.
oh, absolutely, that's exactly what he did. He called him a flat-out liar to these saints and said, I got no wives. Do you see any more? And he did it in this sneaky kind of lawyerish way. If you've ever worked with lawyers, and I was told by non-LDS lawyers, this is only LDS lawyers that do this, but he did this sneaky kind of partial truth thing. It's like Bill Clinton when he answered the question, did you have sex with Monica Lewinsky? Well, technically, no. He didn't have
Depends on what your
sex.
definition is.
Exactly. It's all about the definition. So he could kind of say, I can only see one wife because only one was there. But
Yeah,
he
I
gave
asked
them a
several
completely deceptive, misleading answer.
people, explain this sequence of events and how he's not lying. And the answers that you get, well, first of all, don't really post. I got just not much participation. My family refused to read most of the stuff that I write, and they won't really comment on it. and so I never have a chance to explore their understanding.
Oh yeah, it's better to avoid it than get contaminated by it.
Yeah.
But that's part of the indoctrination as well. So my family did comment, and some more so than others. My sister particularly so. She's a stand-up, and I love her to death because at least she was willing to have discussions and comment and stuff.
Oh, I feel the same way. People that are willing to actually talk about it, I feel such great respect for because they are willing to actually put themselves on the line for
Yeah,
truth.
they're willing to defend their belief. I was
Exactly.
always willing to defend my belief pre, and I'm willing to defend my belief now. And if somebody's willing to stand up and at least take a stand, that's something. That means a lot to me. It's courage.
Yeah.
It's bravery. So I really respected my sister. She was one of the people that commented a lot. I had a few discussions kind of on the side, one with my brother, but not a lot of others. But I didn't realize it, but the Facebook discussions were actually causing a great rift in my family uh, offline. I, I,
They would
I,
talk amongst each other without you about those discussions.
oh yeah, that was a very big thing going on, and it boiled to a head one day when I went to the baptism of my brother's son. I'd actually been to other family events post disbelief, and I didn't participate in the ordinances because I didn't believe, and I respect their right to believe, and I wasn't going to try to sully, stand in the circle with a brother that was blessing a baby. I wasn't going to sully that experience for him, just having a known non-believer there. But I did go to show the family support. This is the one thing that the church does is, and this is common in a lot of religions. It creates a social order for progress. There's the your blessing, there's baptism, there's confirmation, there's the mission. There's kind of this social order that goes on that's part of so it makes you part of the society. Getting the priesthood, getting your woman's award, stuff like that. And
Yeah.
our family's been highly centered around that. That's the 90% of the time. That's the only reason we'd get together was church related. And I had a really rough experience, and I'm not even sure if I want to share it. Maybe I'll just give you some quick details in passing. I felt like I'd been treated real poorly at a baptism, and all the emotions of this debate that had been going on for several months just boiled over and ended up in a yelling match on a church front lawn between me and my parents, and anyway, it
Oh,
wasn't pretty. And and the ultimate result of that was I felt completely disfellowshipped by my family, and so it took a long time to heal from that. In the meantime, I'm venting on RFM about why the church and the stuff that it does to families, and I'm venting about how their church is all about families until somebody apostatizes, and then that guy's an antichrist, an evil person, and anybody that doesn't believe what the church believes, well, they're branded. In fact, recently, I don't know if you saw it, Dallin Oaks branded every atheist an antichrist just today, or not today, just this last week. It's in a newsroom release on the church, and he basically says if you don't believe in Jesus, you're an antichrist, and an atheist is by definition an antichrist. And I'm like, what? I was talking about it with a friend just today at lunch, and he said to me, I said, just so you know, Dallin H. Oak says we're all antichrists, us atheists.
well,
And
that's no surprise, though. He's just stating the obvious, right? Isn't that Korihor's whole position?
oh yeah, it is. It's Korihor's whole position, but my parents refuse to believe it. Hey, just a second. The let's see, get repositioned here. So where was I?
So the event, well, we were talking about Dallin H. Oaks
Oh
branding
yeah,
everyone an antichrist,
yeah. And so I'm at lunch. And I personally experienced that kind of branding.
just with
Uh,
your parents and how
yeah,
they treated you.
exactly. And I experienced some let me just put it this way. You never ever want to look and see your father so afraid of you that he feels like he needs to cast the evil spirits out of you. It's not a pretty fun experience at all.
I imagine.
Um,
The closest I've come is a family member, basically saying, "Listen, you're writing stuff against the church, and from our perspective, that means that you're doing the work of Satan."
yeah,
And
they totally.
so,
Yeah, that's totally what people believe. And fundamentally, it's at the very basis of the belief system. If you ever read the Book of Mormon, it's there. You're a Korahor. If you don't believe, you're somebody that is trampled.
the irony, though, is that I'm not an atheist. I'm still consider myself a faithful Christian, and
Oh,
I've taught.
you're not a Frigidarian yet.
No, I think I'm
Well, there is still hope for you, my son.
an honorary Frigidarian or something, but I've had extensive discussions with my family about my position on that, but it, you know what it really points out is that it's not about Christ, it's about the church. Because
Oh yeah.
if you say, listen, I don't know about any of that other stuff, but I'm willing to accept Christ. I'm willing to accept what he taught about love, and that's good enough for me, then that's not good enough for them. So, if
Yeah.
Christ is not good enough, then is it really a Christian religion? So,
I actually am I believe in the morals of Christianity for the most part.
yeah.
And then the same morals that are in Mormonism I still, hold to. It's just the factual evidence that doesn't jive for me.
Well, that's a topic for a whole other day, because
Yeah, it is.
when we talk about morals, you have to talk about God's law. And when you talk about that, you have to say, well, what is the social effects of drawing a line between people who are in compliance with God's laws and people who are not in compliance with God's laws? And how does that make you feel if you're on one side or the other? And how does that change the way that you interact with people? And it
Oh,
can lead to
absolutely.
things which are absolutely out of harmony with the idea of love that Christ espoused. So we'll save that for another day, though.
Yeah, we'll say that for another day. We could go on for a long time with that.
So
So,
you've kind of gone through this gauntlet with your family about your beliefs. You've
yeah,
done what I think a lot of us have done in terms of you burned some bridges a little bit by being very confrontational and upfront. What's the next step towards the fridge?
well, this is how things started to come to a head. So, I had spent a lot of time on RFM, and during my loss of faith, I had ran a personal experiment, and the experiment was literally I questioned once I questioned Mormonism, I began to question religion in general. That it was hard to decide if it had been happening. I was really questioning the existence of God entirely, and my personal approach to things were, well, uh, once I realized that my boy, your guy's moving in and out weird. Are you still
Oh no,
there?
I'm still here. It's just that when I'm not talking, I can rest my hand.
Oh, I was like, dude, you're passing out over there.
Ah!
I'm like, am I really that boring? Whoa. Yeah,
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
that's okay. That was just funny. I guess this puppet thing, got to get used to it. So, my own personal, I'm an engineer by trade, and one of the reasons I think that I drew the conclusions I did was because for a job, I research. I'm in research and development. I research 4 hours a day at least on the internet to figure out how things have been done, new technologies. I've learned how to dig to the root source of truth versus who's just BSing you. There's a lot of people will say a lot of things, and they could be totally full of it, or they might be legit. And it's important to be able to figure that out if you're going to invent stuff or research new technologies, etc. So a lot of that same approach I brought to my new critical thinking towards religion. And I need to mention this because we kind of missed past it. We talked about the psychology of it and how your feelings don't necessarily prove truth. And Most people actually intuitively understand this. They've just never applied it in this way before. Think of a parable. What's a parable? You can answer that. What's a parable?
Well, for me, it's a story that has an indirect meaning.
It's by definition a false story, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess so.
By
Well, I
definition,
mean,
a
it
parable is
could
a
be
made up.
true. It
It could be
depends on
true.
what you define truth as, because things can be true in principle even if they're not
Ah,
factually true.
exactly. And that's a realization I came to. A parable is by definition a false story, but it's told to teach a true principle, right?
Yeah, that's pretty good.
And
Although real I've had real stories that also teach real principles but are also parables.
correct. But in the Bible, the parables are all, at least I was always taught, hey, these are just made up stories, but they teach a true principle. And here's a question. Do you ever feel the Spirit when you read a parable?
I believe that that's definitely a part of any religious person's, especially Mormon's person's experience.
Absolutely. But then take that to the next level of logic. So you're saying a false story can give you a factual spiritual experience.
Oh, that's easy to explain away, though. You just say that the spirit that you're feeling is based on the true principle, not on the story itself. And then you just say that Christ himself taught in that manner, and so that standard of truth is sufficient.
So think about that assertion. What you're saying is you would have absolutely no way to tell if a person just told you a story, if it was true or false, so long as it espoused a correct principle.
Paul H. Dunn is vindicated.
And Paul H. Dunn came right to mind. When I had this realization, I thought of Paul H. Dunn. I thought, holy cow, I've experienced exactly that. Paul H. Dunn told me completely fake stories. I bought it hook, line, and sinker, and the stories weren't true.
Well, his only
So,
problem was that he portrayed them as true.
absolutely. And what's stopping you from portraying, say, the Book of Abraham is true, or portraying, say, this Book of Mormon is true? Is it really a
Uh,
true history? Is it not? You have no clue based on spiritual experiences. None. Zero.
I think
Dead.
that's the position that they're moving towards for the Book of Abraham in particular.
Yeah, that's a tough one for the church. That thing, I don't know how, but that's just blowing up in their face.
Well, they're gonna.
But that's the whole point. Is you're saying, okay, well, it's true-ish. I mean, they're historically, factually true. The way I think it's Lawrence Lamburn puts it. You know, the issue with the Book of Mormon is its historicity, its reality. It's claimed to be a true, real history, and there is a mountain of evidence against that fact and very little evidence for it. It's easy to see that the evidence that supports it is totally coincidental, but the mountain of evidence against it, the anachronisms, the late war, all this stuff that goes the other way says it's very likely it was made up. By this time, I understood it was, and I just had to understand the spiritual experience. Why would I get a confirmation of something that was true, which was in fact false? Well, that happens with parables all the time. There's actually no surprising point there if you really think about it.
When I started to consider this, I took it one level further and I said that there's actually a great deal of genius in the test of Moroni, because if a religious leader comes and says, "Hey, I'm going to tell you all these outrageous things, believe me," then people, whenever they discover problems, they can simply toss the bum out. Just, oh, it's wrong, kick him out. Okay? But if the leader says, "I'm going to tell you some things, but I don't want you to take my word for it. I want you to go and ask God, and you'll get a feeling. And if you don't get that feeling, then
You're not asking
you're
hard
too
enough.
doubtful. You're not asking. So keep asking until you get the feeling. And when you get the feeling, then that's how you know it's true." So suddenly, if you're ever presented with any contradicting information, it's not a matter of throwing away some third-person prophet. Now you have to confront yourself, and you have to say, "Well, wait a second. I can't reject this without betraying
Rejecting
some
my own. You're
Right, betraying
rejecting
something
my
about
own.
myself.
Yeah, you feel like you're betraying yourself and the declaration you've made. It's actually a very well-known psychological principle. We actually believe that which we invest in. We don't invest that which we believe in. It works the other way around. And
Yeah.
and you're right. The Moroni's promise and the conversion principles, I think, were a stroke of psychological genius. If Joseph Smith was one thing, he was a genius when it came to human psychology. He was doing things humanly that were way advanced, that we've only begun to discover are legitimate psychological tricks on the human brain and mind. And I don't say he was alone in that genius. There have been magicians and gurus and people over the centuries that have all stumbled onto the same type of approach, and great leaders have risen doing the same type of things.
Yeah. For me, I encapsulated it down where there is a predictable sensation that people have when they are exposed to something that resonates with their already sincerely held beliefs. And that's just a natural part of the human creature.
Psyche.
Right. And so that's why commercials know they can make you cry. And
Oh,
that's why
absolutely.
parts of films they know they can affect the emotions of their audience. And so the genius of what Joseph did is he said, okay, I'm going to create the scenario where that part of human psyche is going to be triggered, and then I'm going to plant the seed, this myth of truth, which is that that feeling confirms truth. And
You know,
so then I can capture people that way.
I agree, but I only think my personal opinion is I don't think he consciously knew it. I
Well,
think he probably had an I think he probably well obviously I think he knew he was being a con man. I knew he was lying about the wives, but I think also he had kind of a messianic complex, and I think the way that stuff came out was just natural to him.
no, I agree. I'm not saying that he premeditated and said, I'm going to do this specific thing. I'm just saying that that is the effect of what he did.
I totally agree. And I mean, you can see it when, like, I'm paraphrasing, but there was something where he said, "How stupid are these followers, or how crazy are these Mormons that they'll follow me and right off a cliff, or something like that."
Yeah.
There's things he said that made me think. I don't think he knew quite how good he was at what he was, but he naturally was.
So
So,
you've come to
I,
these realizations about psychology, and where does that bring you closer to the fridge?
well, the my during this time period, so that was a bit of a distraction. I personally questioned everything. Once my shelf collapsed, I decided I needed to question all the presumptions I'd made. And that went right up to the presumptions of Christ being the Son of God, right up to the presumptions of God Himself. And I realized psychologically, the numerous numbers of religions now made complete sense because everybody could get these feelings, and these feelings might hit them, with a particularly, and I use the word morals because we have these morals that we all agree on. You shouldn't kill, you should be nice to your fellow man, help those that are less fortunate than you. All these moral basis for community, well, people can feel those in a particular time when they might feel the spirit, and if they use that to prove that particular religion that they were, considering at the time was true, all religions could be founded on the same basic principle. And that made a lot of sense because if you start studying how Muslims convert, how Jehovah's Witnesses convert, you start studying a lot of the conversion mechanisms, and they're all very similar. There's a spiritual witness, an experience, a transcendental feeling. You get into Buddhism and some of these other things, and the transcendental feeling, and that's commonly talked about. It's looking up at the night sky and realizing just how small you are, and then feeling a connection somehow with the universe. And it's a normal human thing. Now, if you have that experience and say, well, I had that experience when I was, studying the Buddha, all of a sudden you're a Buddhist. It happens real natural to people who are raised in a particular religion, and probably explains, I think, a lot why the majority of people stick with the religions of their youth. That's just normal. And
I'm going to play apologist. All those
Okay.
people didn't really feel the real spirit. They just felt, I don't know what they felt, but it wasn't the real spirit. I felt the real spirit when I read the Book of Mormon. Those other people's experiences are not valid. Only mine is.
And then that's exactly what those other people say about you. If you give
What?
yourself if you give yourself the benefit of the if you actually step outside your own world for a moment and spend time talking to somebody else and give them the same benefit, you realize that's exactly how they feel. I was faced firsthand with it when we gave the missionary discussions to a really good friend in my home. And she described a spiritual experience that was at complete contradictions to the ones that I said the church was true. But I knew her personally. I knew she wasn't lying. I actually felt when she described it that she wasn't lying. And so here I was faced with this connection. She's absolutely truthful. I'm absolutely truthful. And our two experiences say two opposite things. And that stuck with me for a long time because I thought, now why in the world would God do that? And so this led to a lot of experiments. And I'm an experimental guy as well. When I discover something, I try to test it. At my work, I experiment finding problems with electronics all the time. And what you do is you lay out a path and you say, okay, if my assumptions in this are true, then A, B, and C should happen. If that doesn't, then my assumptions must be false. And you literally follow the scientific process in a small way and just check things out. So I began to think critically about God, and I started following the scientific process. And I realized if I can prove anything to be true by a particular methodology, that particular methodology is useless as a proof of truth. For example, I thought, okay, so if a spiritual witness is proof of truth, and anybody can get that just because they might, really need that in their life. You'll run into this with Mormons and evangelicals and other churchgoers alike. They'll say exactly what you said as apologist. Your facts aren't legit, mine are legit. Or they'll say the following. They'll say, well, sure, that person felt the Spirit because God gives the Spirit to everybody. They just got part of the Spirit, and the part that they said applied to their church being true and mine not, well, they just misunderstood that because they were just hearing what they wanted to hear. and we'll literally discount that other person as hearing what they wanted to hear and then think to ourselves, well, I'm not.
But I didn't just hear what I wanted to hear, but those people did.
But those guys did. Yeah, not me, just those guys. And so I started thinking, well, okay, so if what you're saying, what you're saying here is people will pray to anything they want and they'll get the experience they want. Like if they pray hard enough, eventually Moroni's promise will come true as long as they try hard enough. Well, that should apply to anything. And so one night I randomly picked a thought just out of the blue. I said, I'm going to pray to the fridge.
I don't like where this is going.
It's kind of funny, but this is where it's going. So one night I thought, I'm going to just test the most unbelievably crazy thing to see if God is really there.
You're already a heathen idolater.
I am totally a heathen. But that was my thought process. I thought, okay, I can keep track of the good things that happened in my life, and I had a pretty good idea because I could count back and say one thing that happened a lot for me. This is kind of ironic. I was very good at finding car keys when I prayed for them. I lost. I lost. I lost car keys on a mountain once, and I prayed, and I walked and found them. My ability to find stuff when I prayed about it, it was awesome. My first testimony of prayer as like an 8-year-old kid was finding my dad's hammer that I lost. And I didn't want my dad to, lose his cool and lose his temper at me. So I prayed really hard, and I got up, I cleared my mind, and I walked right to it. And
well,
that for me was an answer to my prayer.
If he got mad at you for losing his hammer, he wouldn't beat you with his hammer.
This is true. It was out of fear, trust me. But I would, so I had this testimony of finding things whenever I felt like it, and I felt like I was really good at that. And I felt like my prayers were commonly answered. And so I decided to just exercise exactly the same kind of faith in an appliance in my kitchen and then keep track of the results. Because my whole premise was, if I keep track of the results and I get the same exact results, Well, come on, man. Who believes a fridge is God? That's just silly, right? And so I kept track of stuff for a couple of months. And I know this is going to sound goofy and
Wait,
funny,
hold
but
on a second. Hold on a second. Did you do a control?
well, I had the control from before.
So you just did
It's kind of,
recollection, retrospective
yeah,
recollection for your
yeah. I
control.
used respective recollection because I knew my thought processes had changed. I might not see the things the same way.
Ah,
Um, and so, yeah, I did retrospective recollection, and this is kind of a funny. I'm full on, I'm completely questioning whether God exists. I'm going through this silly experiment to pray to the fridge. One night, my wife can't find her wallet, and I'm thinking, okay then. And I said, well, where were you? And she, I hadn't even seen her. She just, she'd been wandering around the house for a few hours and said, I can't find what. I have no idea where it is. And she'd just driven home, earlier that day, and she'd been home for a few hours. And I thought, okay, well, what would I do? I would normally pray to the fridge or pray to God, right? And then I would clear my mind and I would wait for the impressions to flow to me to see where it was. And I literally did exactly that thing. Now, I got to admit, my prayer to the fridge was pretty half-hearted. I thought what I was doing was really silly. But what are you going to do? But I did the other stuff. I cleared my mind, and I waited for the impressions, and I got thinking about my wife, where she had walked that day. And so I walked outside, I retraced her steps, I walked out to the car, and I kid you not, within like 2 minutes, I found her wallet in a snowbank next to the car under about 6 inches of snow.
in icy snow,
Yeah,
symbolic of the fridge.
that's a good idea. I never thought of that before. But
The
so
fridge was calling to you.
now, I don't want anybody to be mistaken. I don't believe the fridge is God. But I thought,
Oh, that's like you just betrayed the entire thing.
I know I'm anti-fridge. Oh no. Ah, I'm gonna die. But for just a minute,
Okay.
here's what led to this. So I had this experiment, and I realized that you could justify anything. You could justify a belief in the fridge exactly the same way you could justify a belief in God. Exactly the same way. Try it. Take any argument that ultimately proves there is a God, take God out of the word and put in fridge and try to prove it wrong. You
Well,
can't.
hold on a second. It's easy to disprove your little experiment. You just simply have to say that God never actually meddled with people's finding things. That wasn't part of the scope of things that God would actually intervene upon. And so you simply tested a null hypothesis against a null hypothesis or something like that.
Well, sure, you could make that argument, but take it to the next conclusion. So, how would you test that there is a God? Because you can make the same argument about Zeus or Jesus or Jehovah or Elohim. That it's pointless. You can make the same argument, but it doesn't make any difference at all.
Well, people would
People,
just say, well, God set it up so that you can't prove his existence. That way
and
he
and
doesn't
that's
disappear in a poof of logic.
and that's exactly the way the fridge set it up, my friend. Think about
The fridge!
it. So I still am not self-declared a fridge prophet yet.
Okay, so
So
you
so
made
I
this
so I made
discovery.
this experiment. And it left me. I called myself agnostic, and I think that's because I'm not. I don't want to totally say atheist, even though that's probably a more legitimate term. But I hope for something more. I just don't think you can prove it. I think it's unprovable. Um, then
Okay, how
one
do
can
you
hope.
define those two terms? Because everyone seems to, agnostic and atheist, they seem to inject their own meaning into it.
Well, and they are kind of orthogonal. Atheist means, and I read Darwin's. Have you ever seen Darwin's scale? Darwin's scale of atheism. There's like it goes up from levels 1 to 6 or 1 to 7. I don't know. The highest level means you're absolutely 100% sure there is no God. I haven't met any atheist yet that is that sure. For the most part, anybody that's gone down that path is much more willing to say, you know what, I just don't really know. The evidence is weighted heavily against it because of logical A, B, C, D, but I don't really know for sure. And
So,
me, I have kind of a hope. I have kind of a holdout hope that I'm not quite willing to give up. So that makes me a little bit more on the agnostic side, I think. But I don't hold to a specific creed, and that's what agnostics is. That's more of the I don't know side of it.
Okay.
Atheist means you don't really believe there is a God, and you can not be sure. You just don't believe it. You know, you don't really. You can be a Santa. That means you don't really believe Santa is a mythical being that flies around at night, but you can still appreciate the thought of Santa and the hope and joy he brings, right?
No, I don't have to worry about that. I am Santa.
There you go.
I know he exists.
So in the middle of this, I'm because my family is really not willing to talk much with me more about it. And during this time, I'm venting a lot on RFM. I bring up the fridge topic one day, and I said, you know what? Call me silly, but this is my experiment. And there's all sorts on that forum. There's atheists through Christians through whoever on that forum, and it's a place that I found was where I could debate with people and actually check my reasoning, check my logic, and so I kind of threw it out there just as a funny thing, and I got this kind of it spawned some more threads on that forum of people that started preaching fridge scripture. And it was kind of funny, the funniest one I think was that Don, and he said something. He came up with this kind of a scriptural passage, and the end of it I'll never forget. He said, "For many are cold, but few are frozen," and I just laughed so hard. I thought it was so funny, and I actually spent. I did have. I did with my brother have a direct conversation about the fridge and my experiments. Because the thing that bothered my parents the most actually was I wasn't really Christian anymore. And that bothered my dad a lot, and I know it did, and I actually think there's some deep psychological reasons for that because he's a vet, and I respect my father so much as a Vietnam vet and a war hero, and the kind of sacrifices he made, but the psychological pressure a person is put through in that situation, it can leave a lot of scars, and it can require a lot of forgiveness, and I don't know that I could forgive myself for actions in wartime without some belief in a savior or a redeemer to forgive you. I think you might physically just shut down and be one of these guys on the street. My dad never did that. For whatever reason, he was able to come through that, and he taught me a lot of courage and responsibility. And even when your chips are down, that you can stand and walk again. In fact, there's on the Church of the Fridge. There's a bit of a what do you call them? I don't know, soliloquy. I dedicate one of the pages to my father and how he taught me to be brave and some of the things that I learned from the man. So I
Well, I think
mentioned.
there's a whole discussion that could be had just around the psychological effects of Christian belief, specifically around, you know, your actions are in violation of principles that you hold dear. And I think the message of Christ's atonement, even if you just don't pay attention to the claims of deity or anything like that, it carries the potential for psychological healing
Oh,
that
absolutely.
is unique to Christian faith.
I think it does carry that, but I wouldn't say it's unique to Christian faith. And you can find similar thought processes in Buddhism as well as Islam that lead you to the same path of forgiveness.
Oh, that'd be interesting to see.
Ultimately, it's about forgiving yourself, and sometimes that's hard because
Yeah.
you can't reason between the two extremes. And I absolutely think there's situations where it may be nigh impossible for a human being to forgive himself, but to feel forgiveness from another that allows him to function or her to function. So anyway, one night I don't know when the idea of starting the blog first came, but I know I remembered a conversation as we talked about it with my brother, and I told him about the fridge. He's like, "Well, geez, go off and start your own church then, and stop badgering ours." and I thought, and I thought about that, and I don't know. One day I just thought, well, think about this. The point I'm making is anyone can declare themselves a prophet. anyone can start a religion. If you actually can start a religion in a completely inert appliance, then wouldn't that be pretty good proof that that it really is just about us human beings here? It's not so much about some all-knowing, wonderful deity, or some, Christian belief system, or even even atheism or secularism or anything else. That anyone can do it. And as I looked around, I experienced lots of different extremes. As I moved into this new agnostic belief system, and one thing that I saw a lot of that I just didn't agree with me was the rejection of all things religious and rejection of all things spiritual in favor of reason. And the reason I didn't like that is I think that is counter our humanity to a certain extent.
Well, the people that do that would say that it's the bad parts of humanity that are in conflict with reason, and so you're actually improving upon humanity to go with reason.
I think you can be totally improving on humanity to go with reason, but the thing that I can't neglect is, I don't know if you ever read much. Have you ever read much of Joseph Campbell and the
No, I
man
haven't.
of? I suggest reading Joseph Campbell. He wrote a book called The Man of a Thousand Faces. He taught on mythology for years. And have you ever heard of Star Wars?
Oh yeah, you're talking about the monomyth.
Exactly, the monomyth. That's Joseph Campbell. He's
Ah,
he's
okay.
he's one of the founders of the monomyth, and the things that strike out. And something something he said once really stuck with me. He said, you can go talk to people, and from an economical standpoint, you can say, well, here's a guy that will, he'll do this for money. And he said, people will die for their beliefs. They will literally die for what they believe in. And that's far, far more powerful than what we'll do for money or what we'll do for our own good, our own gain. And I think there was a lot of inspiration there. And what I realized is mythology has a purpose. And some of those purposes are the things that we actually cling to. Uh, like the baptisms, like the process. There's a old movie I watched a long time ago. It's called it's an Indian flick. Can't remember it. Rising Sun or Fallen Sky. I don't know. Anyway, in it, young Indian has to go on his walk. They send them out on a spirit walk or something they call it,
Yeah.
and he's supposed to go on that adventure and come back a man. Against a crooked sky. That was it. I knew I'd remember sooner or later. Against a crooked sky. And I actually think it's a white guy in an Indian group that does it to win a squaw or something like that. But the point is, there are ceremonies and things throughout our lives that our community and things we pass through that become actually beautiful. It helps us ground ourselves as part of the community. It helps us become part of society. Now, typically the role that's played that in society is religions. And from my perspective, religions bring some great things in terms of mythology of, being a good person. Well, why should you be a good person? Because this guy was a good person. Why should you do that? Well, because this guy did that. And you build up goodness. A perfect example of it, and I kid a little bit about it, but Santa Claus is a great example of a beautiful myth in my mind. People get wound up all the time that Santa Claus is still in the limelight of Christmas, but stop and think about it from a non-Christian perspective for a moment. Once a year, people rally around this symbol, and they all think about giving stuff to other people. How cool is that?
What kids have you been talking to? Because most kids are not thinking about giving.
I'm not talking about the kids. I'm talking about the parents.
Ah, okay.
The effect on the myth is for the parents. They stop and they think. They try to create wonder and magic in their child's lives. They create this sense of the world is a magical place. And guess what? They eventually instill a little bit of skepticism. So is the mythology really all that bad? I don't think so. And for me, when I kind of had this epiphany and I was going to start this blog, and you'll see it on the tagline, I think myth is a valuable thing in humanity. And the only time it really goes wrong is when we take ourselves too seriously. If if you take the religion so seriously that you blindly follow the leaders, that you start to go down the path of the negative sides of religion, well, that's when you get wars and you can fill a list the length of your arm in teeny tiny print of the bad things religions have caused. But I'll tell you the reason I think that happened is because of the turning over your thought processes to that leader. It's not generally the masses that cause it. It's the ability for us to follow and dedicate everything we have to that particular leader, and then that leader abuses those privileges. So the negatives from religion come from a few bad apples in positions of power. And so my thought was, well, and it's kind of a social experiment, could you have a pseudo-religion that people don't ever take too seriously, but that could preach all the same great things, all the things that are good about religion? Because once I quit believing the old way, I actually sat down and wrote a list of everything I believed. And the list was really long. I believed in the kindness of men, helping each other. I just didn't believe in the weird stuff. I just didn't believe the stuff that actually, if a used car salesman come and told it to you, you'd say, "You're freaking loony, man." And so that was the genesis of it. And so I sat down and I registered the website, started a blog, and next thing you know, I was preaching the fridge.
So tell us a little bit about the organizational structure of the blog. It seems like you're the primary author, but there are other authors?
Yeah, that came to me early on, and actually there's lots of, as you well know, there's lots of different forums. RFM kind of got stale after a while for me, and I started spending time on other forums on Facebook and now a little bit on Reddit. But I started blogging a few times, and I realized, hey, you know what? This is hard to do, me writing everything all the time. It'd sure be cool if somebody else was helping. And one day I was reading a post from the first Popsicle. She goes by Be Very Chill. If you look, they actually have the list of the authors at the top, and we all kind of pick these pseudonames. And it's not really that we're trying to hide, which most people can figure out who we are with a little bit of effort. But we just, honestly, I really want to reiterate the fact it's never meant to be taken seriously, only sarcastically.
So the popsicles are the quorum of the 12 under the Prophet?
Yep, we have 12 popsicles, only not all the seats are full yet. So one day I was reading something Be Very Chill wrote on one of these forums, and I said, "Holy cow, girl, that is awesome what you just wrote. If you ever want to guest blog or, put something on the fridge, I'd love to have you write. You tweak what you wrote there a couple of different ways, and that just is an awesome experience." And she responded, "Hey, that sounds like fun. It's cool." So I'm into the fridge like a sum total of like a month right now, maybe 6 weeks. And Miss Chill, she posts the very first popsicle blog. So because the humor and where we come from, of course, we have 12 popsicles. We have like 5 or 6 seats still open. So any of you out there writers that want to be part of the fridge, just shoot me a note. We'd love to have you. And so the first popsicle, called her immediately to a new position. I said, "Okay, you can be the first popsicle." And she said, "Sweet." And she wrote the most popular post on the fridge ever. And most people I know in the community of Reddit, it was the post called "I Doubt It." And I will take credit for the name. I picked the "I Doubt It" name, but she wrote everything else in that article.
Now, was this the article that was kind of in response to the Doubt Your Doubts thing?
It's exactly the article. No, it landed right. It landed 2 days after the Doubt Your Doubts. She wrote this response to the Doubt Your Doubts, and that became the "I Doubt It" article. And we kind of went back and forth, and I said, I really think an awesome title with this would be "I Doubt It." And if you kind of wrapped it here at the end, you created a little cadence with it, etc. It was a super moving post. and she poured her heart or soul into it, and you could read it in every single line. And it's still the most popular article ever on the fridge. I think the second most popular is the one about the glory of God as intelligence, or the no planet one. I don't know. One of those two's the next, but hers. I noticed her article. I doubt it still gets forwarded and hit all the time. And I think that probably put the Church of the Fridge on the map.
Yeah.
And I need to get her to write more, but she's a busy mom with like three or four, kids under 5. So I don't know if
So
I'll ever get her to write much.
how long ago did the blog start?
We first post I think was September.
Of 2013?
Yep.
Okay.
So we've not been around very long, and over the time frame, once we had one popsicle, it was like, well, hey, we could have more popsicles. That was kind of fun, and I obviously am the most prolific writer, even though I'm not the best writer. I write a lot because I can't stop thinking about things, and writing helps me deal with my thought process. It helps me process what I was in my life before and what I am now, and it also helps me think and helps me guide where I want to go in the future. So we have several popsicles now. I think cherry's one. I try to remember all the names. I can't quite remember them all, but there are literally 6 or 7 popsicles of the fridge now, and
They just write when it comes to them and submit it?
yep, they write when it comes to them, and we have 2 or 3 that are solely dedicated just to editing what other people write. They don't feel like they can write well, but they're really good at proofreading and copy editing, and so they hop on there. And I'm a terrible speller. I'm horrible grammatically, but I did write a book, and I do write on the fridge. So if I have a really good editor, I think my stuff comes out pretty good. But without editing, it looks like a 10-year-old wrote it. So
I can't make any comment on that because all of my stuff is unedited and full of errors and holes.
I think your stuff is so precise. I love reading your stuff.
Oh, that's great.
Yours is one of my favorite blogs to read, and mostly because it has such a deep thought process. I just recently read what one was that I really liked a lot was the twice translated scripture.
Oh, yeah.
That was so awesome.
And that was a mind-blowing discovery when I found that. I'm like, how come this is not in the CES letter and on Mormon Think and all these other places?
Yeah, it was a totally unique find, and I thought it was really awesome. And so I recommend people that when they start talking about, well, what about the 116 pages? I thought, well, dude, look at this.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate the commentary you bring to the blog. I think I bring kind of a different approach. I obviously have taken a much more approach from the spiritual or the emotional side of things. Yeah. I think it's easy when you become more rational to ignore that side of your humanity. And I think I'm not saying that you're doing a disservice. I think your stuff is really awesome. I love reading your blog. I just felt like there was kind of a niche out there, one that approached it from a more emotional context.
I think some of the things that are so appealing about your blog are that it kind of, we talked about this a little bit, it sets up this alternate system that people can look at and analyze and then just kind of on their own see how it applies to their own relationship with the church. Think that's actually kind of what Be Very Chill called it. She said there was a bit of genius, and I think that was kind of something we just stumbled onto by putting kind of a silly bent or a different twist on things. You're able to examine what you believe in a new light. It's very, very hard to overcome the effects of cognitive dissonance without gaining a new perspective. Having personally gone through it, having tried to show other people the same problems, it blows me away how willing we are as humans to simply ignore the obvious. And I don't think it's only human. I don't know if I've mentioned this. I have a dog, actually. You can see her back. There he is.
See her right there? Actually, it's a she. And she's sleeping. She's a cute little puppy. Anyway, she's been a wonderful little puppy, a little dog for us for like 6 or 7 years now. And recently my daughter she wanted a puppy, and I made her learn to wakeboard to get a puppy. And so we got a new puppy in the house here just a few months ago. And what blew me away was the reaction of our original dog. There's this new, shiny new puppy in the house. Now, you got to understand, our dog, you take her on walks, she thinks she rules the roost. She is the number one. She'll take on a dog 15 times her side. She'll just, yap at him and bark at him, and she'll stare down, Dobermans and St. Bernards. And we brought in this tiny little puppy in the house, and the reaction we got from our dog kind of tripped me out. She was totally petrified of this little dog. And it was really weird. The dog that I had that would face down St. Bernards, she wouldn't look at the new little puppy in the eye. She would literally ignore the fact she was in the room entirely. And I did some research on it, because I was trying to figure out, how do I get this dog to accept the other dog in our house? And ironically, I think there's a lot of the same type of thought processes going on in her head. My dog, right in front of me, experienced the effects of cognitive dissonance. It tripped me out, but I'm 100% sure that's what she was doing. She
didn't want to believe that.
She didn't want to believe there was another dog in the house that was cuter than her. It's so funny. Literally, she would jump up on a couch, and she would stare out the window, and the little puppy would run up and start nipping at her nose, and she would turn and stare the other way. The dog's over here, yip, 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 and then she'd turn and stare the other way. No matter where that puppy came, she would not make eye contact with that dog at all. It took us months for her to accept the dog in the house, and she's still totally annoyed by the little mutt, but she's come to accept that she lives here and will actually look at her once in a while. But the irony of it is I'm watching this behavior in the animal kingdom in my own home, and at the same time I'm watching exactly the same behavior when I approach people with topics of the church. They simply ignore it, won't look at it, won't approach it. It's too scary to think about. It shakes your whole world up, and you'll ignore it. You just won't pay any attention to it.
How much of your writing now is therapeutic for you, and how much of it is just working through things or trying to share your thoughts?
I think it's still very therapeutic. My life now is one of exploration and discovery. You probably hear this a lot in the community. It feels like a new part of your life has opened up, and you can learn things without fearing that they contradict something else you already know. You're able to accept new information. I don't know if you know the feeling I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah.
Before, everything I learned, I had to filter through the church. I had to filter through this lens of, well, if the church supports this, then it's okay. If the church doesn't support it, well, I need to set that aside. And so, things like, you didn't have to shelf the idea that the Earth is 6,000 years old, and every scientist on the planet says, yeah, BS, man. You can actually go, well, those guys were wrong. They were just making things up, and they didn't know any better at the time. So 6,000 year number, it's wrong. But that means we can go explore this topic and look at the research and study the information. It's like a whole new world of learning has opened up, and for me that's been amazing and fun, and I enjoy it a lot. And I study a lot of psychology, I think, because that's part of how I ended up where I am, was studying the psychology.
For me, part of it is learning the power of rejection, of no, of being able to say, no, that's not true, and be able to do that without fear. And it applies both to tangible things like, the age of the earth, but it also applies to more ethereal or metaphysical things that affect how you view the world around you. The church went through that transition when the blacks got the priesthood, and there were some people that were saying no, and they didn't have the fear of the religion spurning them. And we're seeing some of that happen now around women and homosexuals and things like that.
Oh, absolutely. You're actually able to it's like thinking for yourself for the first time.
Yeah.
It's totally enlightening. And that's the metaphor for the fridge. If you open the door, the light will shine forth. But
But
I
it's
love
light on when you close the door.
the
The
light closes when
quintessential
you close the
question.
door. The fact that the fridge turned into having so many funny metaphors that made so much sense, I thought was just lucky.
Proof of its truthfulness.
Exactly.
Or
If
it's
you,
proof that people will find meaning no matter what they're looking at, which
well, well,
explains why people can keep going to the temple for so many years and still claim to find new meaning.
absolutely. If you if you always support the fridge by putting into it what you hope to achieve someday, when you open the door, it will provide you with sustenance and drink. It's so metaphorically awesome that I sometimes can't stop.
All right, well, I think this is probably a good time for us to go ahead and stop this interview before it gets so
Did we
long
do
that no
another
one
hour
ever
and a
reaches it.
half?
We could
People
do
will
a
never.
part three, but we may separate things out and talk a little bit about specific topics in the future. But I want to
That'll be
thank
awesome.
you for taking the time to sit down and share with us your story and how you got to where you are now. And we look forward to more teachings from the fridge in the future.
Well, I like the idea that Thinker is here talking about the fridge. So think about the fridge.
Haha. All
See,
right.
it all makes sense.
Okay, take care.
Nice, bless you.